At the family party, my father raised his glass, smiled, and told me to leave. No warning, no hesitation. Just those words loud enough to cut through the laughter and clinking glasses. I stood up, heart hammering. My napkin still in my lap. My breath caught halfway to protest. Everyone turned to look some confused, others pretending not to hear. But then Jonah stood up too. My husband's chair scraped against the wooden floor with a sound that silenced the room even more than my father's cruelty. And what Jonah said next didn't just defend it shattered the illusion my family had protected for decades. That was the night I stopped trying to earn love I should have always had. That was the night my husband taught the man me what real family actually means. But to understand how we got to that moment, I need to take you back to the beginning. Growing up in the Harper household felt like living inside a glass museum. Everything was pristine, orderly, admired from the outside, but fragile if you got too close. My father, Gerald Harper, was the curator of that world, a successful litigation attorney with a reputation for being razor-sharp in court and colder at home. My mother, Ruth, tried to soften him. I think she had a quiet elegance about Hirsch-loved books, lavender tea, and painting things in muted colors, but even she couldn't protect me from the way my father measured worth. He didn't shout, he didn't hit, he simply made it clear. Love was conditional and performance was everything. My siblings understood this early. Bryce, the eldest, thrived under his rules. Varsity athlete, law school top honors, now climbing the ladder at one of Dad's former firms. Lauren, the golden girl, went into medicine. Of course, cardiothoracic surgery, just like Dad had hoped. Their successes were celebrated with champagne and speeches. Mine were tolerated. From a young age, I loved stories. I wrote poems in the margins of my math homework. I stayed up late reading under the covers with a flashlight. I wasn't rebellious, I was just different. But in our family, different meant disappointing. I still remember my 8th grade award ceremony. I'd won a statewide fiction contest, and my story was going to be published in a youth journal. I handed Dad the printed certificate, just hoping for a flicker of pride. He glanced at it and said, "You know, writing doesn't pay the bills, right?" I nodded, trying not to let it show that he'd taken the wind out of me. From that moment, I started hiding the parts of me that didn't fit. I applied to college as a business major just to make things easier. But once I got there, I couldn't fake it. I switched to English Lit halfway through my freshman year and paid the price for it. Literally. My father cut off all financial support. "If you're going to chase dreams," he said, "you can do it on your own dime." And I did. I worked in the campus library, I took out loans, I graduated with honors, and when I got a job at a small but scrappy publishing house, I thought just maybe he'd finally see that I wasn't lost. I was just not like them. But nothing ever changed. Even at family gatherings, I was always the afterthought. Conversations moved around me like I was a ghost in the room. If I mentioned work, it was met with polite nods or redirected questions. I learned to shrink myself to make others comfortable. Then I met Jonah. And for the first time in my life, someone saw me, really saw me, and didn't ask me to change a thing. I met Jonah Harper on the kind of rainy Tuesday that makes you late for everything. I ducked into a tiny neighborhood bookstore to get out of the storm, trailing water and regret from another tense brunch with my father. I wasn't planning on buying anything, but I wandered as always toward the fiction shelf, the place where the world felt wide and forgiving. Jonah was already there. He had a book in each hand, deep in thought, comparing blurbs with the seriousness of someone choosing a life philosophy. He glanced up, caught me smiling at his intensity, and returned it with the kind of grin that makes you forget your shoes are soaking wet. "You go first," he said, noticing I was reaching for the same book. "I've read it," I said. "You should. The ending stays with you." He nodded and tucked it under his arm. "You always judge books by their endings, only people." That made him laugh. An open, honest sound. He bought both books and offered to buy me tea next door. I hesitated, but something about him felt safe, easy. That afternoon turned into 3 hours of conversation. I told him I worked in publishing, that I loved stories but hated industry politics. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask if I was planning to do something more practical. He just listened like it mattered. I didn't tell him about my family right away. I didn't tell him how small I felt when I was around them, how every compliment came with a caveat, or how I'd trained myself to expect disappointment. But he saw through it somehow. On our third date, I mentioned how I was scared of failing, that I always felt like I was one step away from not being enough. He looked at me and said, "Who told you that lie?" I didn't answer, but he didn't press. Instead, he showed me over time what it looked like to be loved without a scorecard. Jonah made coffee every morning and left the light on when I worked late. He cheered when one of my authors landed a mid-sized book deal like it was the Pulitzer. He asked about my writing. He asked about me. The first time he met my family, he wore a navy blazer and brought a bottle of wine. My father said, "You're in tech, right? Not a real job, but at least it pays." Jonah smiled politely, but his eyes flicked toward me, concerned. "Afterward," he said gently, "you never have to prove yourself to them. Not to anyone. It was the first time someone gave me permission to stop performing." When we got married a year later, my father didn't walk me down the aisle. He said he was busy that weekend. My brother sent a check. My sister texted, "Congrats." But Jonah's family came. His mom cried. His dad called me Armelis. And for the first time in my life, I belonged. It arrived on thick ivory cardstock sealed in an envelope with my father's monogram and gold foil. Just seeing it made my stomach clench. At first, I thought it was for someone else. My name looked so out of place next to that kind of formality. But there it was in my father's stiff handwriting. Harper Family Celebration hosted by Gerald Harper. Formal attire, immediate family only, no mention of what we were celebrating. No warm note, just logistics, a date, a location, a time. I stared at it for a long while before setting it on the kitchen counter. Jonah was making coffee, humming softly, and glanced over. "Something from work," he asked. I handed him the envelope. He read it, then looked at me with that familiar mixture of concern and patience. "You don't have to go. I know," I said. But I couldn't stop staring at it. Maybe this is, I don't know, a step, an olive branch. He wouldn't invite me just to humiliate me, right? Jonah didn't answer immediately. He just reached for my hand. "If we go together. And you don't owe anyone any, especially not pain dressed up as family." I nodded, but a small, ridiculous part of me still hoped. Maybe he was softening. Maybe with Mom gone, he finally saw how fractured we'd become. I bought a dress, dark green satin, the kind that whispered elegance without trying too hard. I had my hair done even though I hated salons. Jonah wore his navy suit, the one he kept for weddings and meetings with investors. In the car on the way there, my heart wouldn't slow down. I kept rehearsing polite things I might say, ways to start again. Maybe Dad would say he'd read one of my authors. Maybe he'd ask me a real question. Instead, he didn't even greet us at the door. The party was at my parents' old house now. Technically his house since Mom had passed. The lawn was trimmed like always. The porch light glowed like nothing had changed, but everything had. Inside, the music was soft jazz, the kind my father liked. My sister Lauren wore a floor-length gown and was already sipping champagne. My brother Bryce laughed loudly in the center of a circle of colleagues and cousins. No one rushed over to greet me. Lauren raised an eyebrow. "You made it," she said flatly. Then she looked at Jonah. "I see you're still together." "Still," Jonah replied coolly, placing a hand on my back. "And doing well." Bryce barely glanced up when I passed. "Hey, Mel," he said as if I were a mail carrier, not his sister. I found myself shrinking again, folding into that quiet version of myself I had perfected over the year, smiling politely, saying nothing, waiting to be seen. I didn't know yet what my father had planned, but I felt it like the heaviness in the air before a storm. The living room had been rearranged to look like a small banquet, all white tablecloths, crystal vases, soft music drifting through the air like everything was perfect, except it wasn't. As Jonah and I moved through the space, I realized something. No one made room for us. Conversations flowed around us like we weren't there. No one asked about my work or my life, or even offered the kind of hollow compliments that families usually exchange at parties. We were guests, but also intruders. Lauren was standing near the fireplace holding court in a red silk gown. She gestured dramatically as she told a story about a difficult patient who'd nearly bled out, but was saved by her swift hands. The people around her laughed and nodded, clearly captivated. When she saw me, she didn't stop talking. Just gave me a once-over and said, "Melis, green's a bold choice, but at least you're trying." I bit my tongue. Bryce was surrounded by younger men from Dad's firm. They toasted to promotions, bonuses, investment portfolios. When I walked by, one of them asked, "So, what do you do?" Before I could answer, Bryce cut in. "She works with books, like editing or publishing or, stuff like that." "Cute," the guy said, raising his glass. "We need more creative types." I nodded as if I hadn't just been erased. Jonah leaned close to my ear. 10 more minutes, he whispered. "Then we can say our hellos and go home." "I can make it through dinner," I whispered back. More to convince myself than him. When it was time to sit, I noticed something even more deliberate. The long dining table had place cards. Lauren was seated to my father's right, Bryce to his left. Jonah and we were placed at the far end next to Great Aunt Marlene, who spent most of the night spooning mashed potatoes onto her napkin and asking if Jonah was my driver. I felt like I was watching my family celebrate something I hadn't been invited to, like I was the mistake they had all silently agreed to tolerate for one night. The food was excellent. Dad always hired caterers for these things, but it tasted like cardboard in my mouth. My father had barely acknowledged us all evening, and yet I kept watching him, waiting, hoping for a glance, a word, a sign. He laughed with Lauren, clinked glasses with Bryce, spoke animatedly with his colleagues from the firm. I sat across the room and felt like a shadow in my own bloodline. Jonah squeezed my hand under the table. "You don't owe them your pain," he said quietly. "Not tonight, not ever." I nodded, but the ache inside me only grew heavier. I didn't know he was going to raise a glass in the next few minutes. I didn't know he was about to turn that room into a courtroom, and I was the case he'd already decided to dismiss. The sound of a spoon tapping gently against a wine glass rang out sharp, clear, unmistakable. My father had risen. Everyone quieted. He didn't have to ask for attention. Gerald Harper had always commanded it. He stood at the head of the table, tall and composed, holding his crystal glass like a gavel. His gaze swept the room, pausing on each of his children. Lauren, then Bryce, before finally landing on me briefly. Barely. "I want to thank you all," he began, "for being here tonight. It means a great deal to me to celebrate with those who matter most." A soft chorus of agreement rose from the table. He continued, "We've had our share of challenges, but this family has always persevered through discipline, through excellence, through shared values." Jonah's fingers tightened slightly around mine. I look at my son Bryce, head of his division before 35. A man of integrity and leadership, a round of applause, and Lauren, whose surgical precision has saved lives, and whose grace makes us all proud. Another wave of claps and murmurs of approval. I stared at my plate, cheeks burning. My fork felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "And then," he said, lifting his glass slightly higher, "there are those who choose a different path, who chase dreams and call it passion." My heartbeat slowed. I've always believed that success comes from contribution, tangible, measurable contribution. And then he looked straight at me. "I'm sorry, Melis," he said, his voice calm, emotionless. "But tonight is not for you." The room went silent. You could hear the fire crackling in the hearth, the clink of someone's fork dropping, the faint inhale of someone holding their breath. And then he said it. "I think it's best if you leave." I blinked. Had I heard him wrong? I looked around. No one moved. No one said a word. Bryce sipped his wine. Lauren examined her cuticles. No one looked shocked. No one objected. My napkin was still in my lap. My hands had gone cold. Slowly, I stood because what else could I do? I felt every pair of eyes follow me. I was the spectacle, the failure, the family's shame, the one who didn't belong. I wasn't crying, not yet, but I felt the sting building. And then Jonah's chair scraped against the floor. He stood beside me. I turned to look at him, but he was already facing my father, and there was something in his eyes I had never seen so clearly before. Fire. Pure, quiet fire. The kind of rage that doesn't explode. Debut cuts sharper than anything screamed. The room held its breath. And then Jonah reached for his own glass. "I'd like to say something too," he said. My father's jaw clenched. "This isn't your place." But Jonah was already raising his glass. And in that moment, I knew everything was about to change. Jonah's voice was calm, but it cut through the air like glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he repeated, this time louder, clearer, steadier. The room froze. Forks midair. Conversations dead. Heads turning. My father narrowed his eyes. "You're not family," he said. Jonah didn't blink. "That's debatable. But tonight I'm the only one acting like it." A few gasps. I wasn't breathing. I couldn't move. My knees felt hollow. But my heart was racing. Not from shame this time, but from something deeper. Older. A part of me that had always hoped someone, anyone, would speak for me. Jonah continued. "To the woman you just told to leave," he said, turning slightly toward me. "My wife, Melis." He held up his glass, but his eyes were locked on my father. "You say tonight is for people who matter. Let me tell you who matters." The room pulsed with discomfort, but no one interrupted. Melis built her life without a safety net. She paid her own tuition when you cut her off. She worked 2 jobs while finishing her degree. She launched her own imprint in grit and vision alone and gave dozens of authors their first shot. He paused. "She's been featured in literary festivals you've probably never heard of because you never asked. Her work has touched veterans, immigrants, single moms, and teenagers who've never seen themselves in a book before. She's helped people feel seen." He lowered his glass slightly. "But none of that matters to you, does it?" My father's face was unreadable, but his knuckles had gone white on his wine stem. "Because you don't measure success in impact. You measure it in status, titles, control." Jonah's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "And when Melis refused to conform to your vision of value, you didn't just dismiss her. You erased her publicly on purpose." More than one person at the table shifted uncomfortably. My cousin glanced at me, then quickly away. Jonah took a breath, then looked around the table. "To the rest of you, if this feels awkward, it should. You watched a father humiliate his daughter in front of everyone. You said nothing. Some of you even smiled. Silence. Heavy. Honest. Jonah looked at me, then softening. But here's what matters. Melis, I see you. I've always seen you. Not as the daughter who failed to meet someone else's checklist, but as the woman who had the courage to define herself. I bit my lip, but it was no use. The tears spilled quietly down my cheeks, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being defended. Jonah turned back to my father. You told her to leave. Fine, we'll both leave. He gently set his glass down. but don't ever mistake your silence for authority again. You may control this house, you may dominate this family, but you do not get to dictate her worth. He walked to my side, took my hand, steady, certain, warm. I didn't look at anyone. I didn't need to. As we walked toward the exit, the silence behind us was absolute. No apologies, no protests, until we reached the door. If you leave now, my father called out, voice cracking just slightly. You're cut off permanently. Jonah didn't stop. Neither did I. But just before we stepped outside, he said without turning back, your money was never what we needed. Your love was. And that offer expired a long time ago. The door closed behind us with the softest click. But in my chest, it sounded like freedom. The drive home was quiet. Not the heavy, suffocating kind of silence that used to stretch between my father and me, but something different. Gentler, spacious. Like air finally let back into a sealed room. Jonah didn't speak. He just held my hand, steady and warm, his thumb tracing circles on my skin. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights, unsure if what I felt was heartbreak or relief, maybe both. When we got home, I barely made it to the couch before the tears came. Not the quiet, restrained kind I'd mastered over the years, but loud, aching sobs that ripped through me in waves. Jonah sat beside me the whole time, letting my grief crash against him like he was the shore and I was the sea. I'm sorry, I gasped between breaths. You didn't sign up for this. Yes, he said firmly, brushing hair from my face. I did, and I'd do it again. That night, I didn't sleep. My body was still. But my mind replayed every moment this voice. Their silence. The look on Lauren's face like I was the one ruining something sacred. The next morning, there was a text from Bryce. That was unnecessary. Dad was just trying to celebrate. A message from Lauren came 2 hours later. You always make things about you. Hope you're happy. I didn't reply. For the first time, I realized they weren't confused. They weren't surprised. They just didn't care. And maybe they never had. 3 days later, I made an appointment with a therapist. Someone I'd quietly bookmarked years ago, but never dared to call. Her name was Dr. Elaine Sodto. Her voice on the phone was calm, grounded, the kind of tone that didn't demand anything from me. I've been trying to prove something for a long time, I told her in our first session. But I don't even know what it is anymore. She nodded thoughtfully. Do you know what it feels like to be loved without performance? I didn't answer. The truth felt too raw. Over the next few weeks, I began to unspool years of silence. Dr. Sodto helped me name things I had once dismissed: emotional neglect, covert gaslighting, family enchantment. You survived by becoming small, she said gently one day. Now it's time to take up space. And slowly I did. I started writing again. Not for work, not for deadlines, but for myself. I wrote messy journal entries, angry letters I never sent, poems that made me cry. Jonah and I began looking at listings in another city somewhere, quieter, farther, new, a clean slate. One afternoon, as I packed a box of old photos, I found a childhood drawing tucked between pages of a yearbook. It was a picture of a girl with a cape and books for wings. I stared at it for a long time. That girl had never really left. She'd just been waiting for someone to remind her she could fly. 1 year after that dinner party, I stood barefoot in the nursery, rocking my daughter as spring rain tapped gently against the window. Her name is Lena Ruth Harper. Lena for light. Ruth for my mother. The only person in my childhood who ever made me feel unconditionally safe. She was only 6 weeks old, but already she had Jonah's calm eyes and a grip stronger than expected for someone so small. When she wrapped her fingers around mine, it felt like a promise, like she was telling me, I'm here and I see you too. Jonah entered the room, a warm mug of tea in one hand and a soft smile on his face. Everyone's waiting, he said. Ready. I nodded and followed him into the living room in our new home outside Seattle. Soft string lights lined the ceiling. Our closest friends, Jonah's parents, my coworkers. Even Aunt Nancy gathered around a cake that said, Welcome, Lena. No speeches, no tests. Just laughter and arms that reached out to hold our child without conditions. Later that evening, after everyone left, I found a letter waiting by the door. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. My father's. I didn't open it. Not because I was angry. Not anymore. But because I no longer needed whatever was inside. His words no longer shaped me. His approval no longer defined me. His silence no longer hurt me. I placed the envelope in a drawer, not as a wound, but as a reminder of the woman I used to be, the one who begged for permission to belong. Now I belong to myself. And to this life I'd built brick by brick, word by word, choice by choice. That night, I sat beside Lena's crib, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. I thought about all the things I'd once been afraid to say, all the truths I'd buried under politeness and shame and hope that never came. And so I whispered the words I wish someone had said to me as a child. You are already enough. You don't have to earn my love. It's yours completely, unconditionally. As I said it to her, I realized I was saying it to myself, too. To the little girl with the drawing of books for wings. To the young woman who walked out of a room full of family and found freedom waiting on the other side. To the mother I had become. And to the daughter I was always meant to be.